All right. So, just tell me when you already hit record.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Let's get it. So, good day to everyone. We are here to do the next installment in our series of FMS interviews on colonialism and its effects in Africa. My name is Wanda Gumise, and I'm here today with Professor Jakob Lempp. Now, Professor Lempp, in addition to his PhD on the evolution of the European Council, has studied in political science, communication science, and philosophy. And we hope he gives us some really good insights on our topic today, which is post-colonialism and neocolonialism effects and remedies on modern development in Africa. Good day to you. Welcome, Professor
Thank
Lempp.
you.
All right. So I guess we will start with more of an introduction. Could you give a brief description on what you think is post-colonialism and neocolonialism? Yes.
I mean, that's from my point of view, it's two slightly different things. That's quite obvious. Post-colonialism is more like an academic field. It's more like a field of studies that mainly aims at answering the question: how did colonialism itself, influence societies, both in the colonized countries, for example, in African societies, but also which effects did colonialism have on the colonizing countries, mainly Europe. So it's an academic field, but also it contains some normative aspects. It's not purely descriptive, or it's not purely aiming at explanation. It also clearly states a normative statement, for example, by explicitly criticizing those constructed national identities in some of the African states that were created basically by the colonizers. But also it is a normative field of studies, because it aims at destroying this image of the good colonizer that comes to Africa, bringing civilization, bringing education to those poor people there. And post-colonialism as an academic field of study tries to criticize this image, but also by making transparent, inherent and latent racisms that exist in the ways people often talk about colonialism, about Africa in general. So it's not only descriptive, it has this normative attitude. Whereas neo-colonialism, I would say, is not so much an academic field of study. It's more like an ideology, a political ideology. It's more like a real claim, not necessarily of academians, but also of politicians. I mean, it was this concept of neo-colonialism was developed by a politician. One of the major figures in that context is certainly the first president of Ghana, who developed these ideas. And the central idea here is that the Western countries, European countries, the US, that they continue to control and to influence African societies, or the societies of the formerly colonized countries, through capitalism, through globalization, through cultural imperialism. And so the aim of those people in the context of neocolonialism is rather more a political aim. It is also based on a broad, theoretical context. It is based in leftist ideologies. It is based in Leninism. I mean, the original Leninist thought that the inherent conflicts in Western countries, in industrialized countries, or in industrializing countries, are somehow exported to the third world, to Africa, via those mechanisms. Most importantly, via the mechanism that it's mainly primary commodities that are exported from Africa to Europe or to the West. And in return, what they get back is manufactured goods.
Okay.
thereby transform.
In that context, would you say you consider neocolonialism as sort of resultant of the fact that colonialism existed, or as something that the Western powers chose to do as a result of maybe necessity to have some kind of political influence in Africa?
Yeah, first of all, the question is that true? Is that entirely true? Or is that maybe only one? It's certainly the perception of many African, politicians and also Western thinkers that this holds true. But on the other hand, I think, from my personal point of view, colonialism is absolutely an important factor that explains the current situation in Africa, for example. But it is not the only factor. There are many other factors that contribute to the explanation why we have the situation in Africa as we have it at the moment.
All right.
So that's my major point here. Yeah.
So before we actually talk about the other issues which you think might be a cause of the current situation in Africa, let's maybe start with the effects which you think colonialism has had.
Of course.
So we'll start maybe on effects you think colonialism has had on African people's psychology, mental state, and emotional state. What do you think about that?
Certainly, and of course, the key question. I mean, that's absolutely the important question we have to answer before we try to evaluate and try to draw conclusions from that. So that's an empirical question. Which effects did colonialism have on African societies? I mean, I'm a political scientist, so political effects are the first that come to my mind.
Okay.
And certainly the most important effect was the drawing of borders of nation states that were constructed and created, or of states that were created in Africa through post-colonial borders that did not necessarily take into account the situation in those countries or in those territories. And that led to the situation we have today with an African continent with 54 different states, where borders do not always reflect the needs and the ideas and the opinions and the languages and religions and ethnicities of the people living in those countries. And this had major effects, mainly bad effects on development issues, on conflict issues in Africa until today. I mean, that's where Africa suffers from until today. On the other hand, I mean, those borders exist now.
Yes.
Those states exist.
They clearly
So it is one thing to argue they exist, but not because of the African peoples in those states actually wanted them to have it like this, but because of the colonial powers installed those states. That's one thing. But the other thing is, now we have to work with what we have, and of course it is also an asset to have these bureaucracies, to have these states, because simply states fulfill important functions in terms of stabilizing societies and providing order and so on.
Okay. What about on the people themselves?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult issue, because most people who live in Africa now, it's the youngest continent on Earth. So people tend to be young in Africa, and most people who live in Africa today didn't directly experience colonialism. So it's more like an image. It's more like indirect effects. It's more like effects via the infrastructure that was built partly by colonial powers, and the effects of all that on also the mental state, the psychologies of individual people. Those effects are diverse. I mean, it's difficult to say colonialism made African people like this. I mean, that's a bit too broad. On the other hand, it's from my point of view still, I mean, or literature argues that there are some effects I mean, it's in your name as a group of people who focus on these issues. The mental slavery issue is, of course, a concept that is interesting to cover. I mean, this idea, this experience, even if it's an indirect experience of dependency, that might have an effect on how people perceive the world.
Okay, the people who have this view that colonialism created some kind of mental slavery on the African people, where do you think they're drawing from? Do you think they actually have sort of a plausible claim? Because a lot of people would say that, oh, well, that is sort of a coy attempt at just avoiding the real issues that maybe African people might have. But so what do you think about
I see both arguments. I see two dangerous paths. The first dangerous path is that you make things too easy and you claim everything that is bad is because of colonialism, so it's not our fault. That would be too easy. On the other hand, it's clear that colonialism did have effects, and also a whole range of negative effects that are somehow unfortunately sustainable in Africa. So I think the claim of neo-colonialism is at least partly plausible, if it's not stated in that radical way that you use this argument as an excuse of doing nothing. I don't think that this is a major problem, but I see this danger at least.
One group of people who claim that they certainly had a direct interaction with colonialism are most African leaders. Now, how do you think colonialism has affected the state and the behavior and the decisions, the actions of a lot of these African leaders?
I mean, first of all, most African states are a direct result of colonialism.
Yes.
So therefore, also the governments, the leaders, the authorities in those states, they exist because of colonialism. I mean, there are exceptions. We know that Ethiopia was never really colonized, that there were independent African traditions of statehood. It's a slightly different notion of statehood than the Westphalian system of statehood with territory and boundaries and sovereignty and all that. But still, there are inherent African traditions of statehood. However, that's rather the exception. The main issue is most leaders lead their countries because the countries exist as a result of colonialism. Those authorities were installed directly or indirectly by colonialists. And that's why it's an ambivalent relationship, because it's difficult to criticize the reason why you are the leader of a country, right? On the other hand, we have those independent movements in many states. We have I just quoted the founder of neo-colonialism as an ideology, who was the first president of independent Ghana. So there are these movements as well. And also neo-colonialism became a driving force, a driving ideological force in many of those independent movements. It sometimes even became militant, and there were guerrilla forces in Angola, for example, that were somehow inspired by these ideas. So the relationship between colonialism and the current generation of leaders in Africa is certainly ambivalent, because I also see that the ways how in many African states government is actually done, it resembles quite the ways how government was done in practice in European states during the time of colonialism.
Okay.
So that goes down until written forms that look a little bit like the old French written forms back in the 1950s. Because of the whole idea of the nation state, the government, how all that has to work, the administration was more or less, of course, but mainly copied from the way the colonizers did it.
Okay, then before we move to the next part, let me just check. Is everything okay there? All right, going good. Okay, so all right, so I think at this moment I'd want to reset the frames just so we at least make sure this DSLR is like stopping at a certain time. So we'll do one last part before we move to the last question phase.
Okay.
All right. If you can actually get a different angle at some point. So get do that. All right. Okay. So to continue, I would want to move to the economic effects that you think colonialism has had on Africa. Now, a lot of the kind of mindset around the economy of Africa is that it's really bad and it's never developed and it always has been like that. It always will be like that. And the fact that I'm here, right? Having come all the way from my country, Zimbabwe, to study here is already an indicator that there are some certain problems. So yes, it isn't a lie that a lot of African countries have economic problem. Despite, although I say that sometimes the mentality that the Western powers have on it is kind of false because they have the media sort of like given effect, which they are made to see. But however, I would be interested in knowing at least to what extent you think that colonialism has had on the current economic situation of a lot of African countries.
A whole complex of issues. The media image in Western countries about Africa, the effect of colonialism on the economy in economies of African territories back in the time of colonization, or the effects that we see today. I mean, what we can clearly state is that Africa is the poorest continent on Earth, the continent with the lowest level of development. If we use indicators like the Human Development Index, it's the weakest continent if we use indicators like GDP. The combined GDP of all 55 African countries is significantly smaller than the GDP of Germany.
Okay.
So that's a fact. But we
on face value, why do you actually think that is? Because there are a lot of other Asian countries which had been colonized before, but they're no longer in the same situation. So why do you think it ended up like that?
I mean, that's an extremely relevant question. We can see that colonization had different effects in different areas, firstly. And secondly, it also depended on the colonizing power. I mean, there are these... let alone the moment of independence did play a role. The Portuguese colonies, for example, who became independent in the 1970s only, were, for a very long period after that, the colonies worst off compared with colonies that were former colonies of Britain. British colonies may do better than former French colonies. So all this had an effect. But what is quite clear, I think, is that colonization also had negative economic effects on the colonized countries. I mean, that's quite clear. The whole idea of colonizing foreign territories was to exploit those territories economically. I mean, that was the idea about colonization, and that is also what happened. I mean, the primary idea was exploiting mainly primary commodities, ivory, wood, I mean, whatever, raw materials, and to take all those raw materials and materials to the colonizing countries. And that, of course, had a very negative effect on the economies of those territories already back in the time of colonization. But the second effect, of course, was the issue of slavery. I don't mean mental slavery; I mean real slavery. That started even before the age of colonization, already in the 16th century. Well, we had the issue of slavery, and that, of course, was also negative for those societies, and may have a negative effect even on the economies of today, because it's a demographic issue. I mean, taking people, in a large share of people from those territories must have a negative effect.
Okay.
And today, of course, I mean, that's the idea of neo-colonialism. That's the idea of other also economic theories that develop from neo-colonialism. Dependencia, for example, the Prebusch-Singer thesis, that simply state that even today, after the phase of colonization, Western countries exploit those former colonies by using their raw materials and by selling their manufactured goods. And that stabilizes a center-periphery structure, not only politically, but also economically, that is of disadvantage to those African colonies, or, well, to the African former colonies, African states. And that's something I think explains quite a lot of the situation that we have today, but not everything. That's another issue.
So moving on to the question phase here, I think the first and obvious question would be how you think Africa can counter these effects which have been brought forth by colonialism and post-colonialism on the continent itself.
A first positive thing to say is that it obviously starts doing so. I mean, it's true that Africa is the economically weakest continent on Earth, but it's also a continent with, compared, for example, to Europe, with higher growth rates, economic growth rates. I mean, that was impressive. Since the 1990s, in many African countries and in Africa as a continent, things start to go better than before. I mean, that's right. It's developing economically and in many respects. So something was done already, but your question mainly aimed at what are the remedies that like still could be done. And I think, first of all, what needs to be done is fighting those factors that resulted from colonialism and do have these negative effects on the economy societies. One is borders that don't reflect the needs of the people. One remedy against that could be integration, supranational integration. That's also, I mean, that's what we can see in many regions within Africa. That's what we can see in the process of the Organization of African Unity, and then finally into that became the African Union. I mean, those ideas of regional integration, be it all of Africa, be it parts of Africa, aim at overcoming the negative effects of colonialism by transferring sovereignty from those, well, definitely not natural, somehow ill-constructed nation or states with ill-constructed borders onto a supranational level. That's one remedy. And another, of course, is we have to talk about corruption. If we talk about African leaders, we need to talk about corruption, and we need to talk about fighting corruption. There are best practices. Corruption is not everywhere in Africa. There are states where this is a huge issue, and there are states where this issue, well, was fought against effectively.
Okay. Now, do you yourself think that Western powers are interested in promoting the African economy? I'm
convinced that they
benefit in that. Would they be interested?
It's a good question. I'm absolutely convinced that Western countries would say yes. And I mean, we can see that there is development cooperation. There is a certain percentage, not such a high percentage, but a certain percentage of money invested into development cooperation projects. Well, I'm not 100% convinced that all of those development projects really end up in helping the countries where this development cooperation takes place. Most money actually flies to or comes back to those who provide the development aid. So whether this is really effective, that's a huge issue. We have a whole study program in our faculty that tries to answer that question. Sustainable development management, how to manage development projects in a way that they are actually effective and sustainable. I mean, that's That's what they aim at, and they often fail to actually be effective in practice, and that's of course a problem. And on the other hand, I think that the events taking place in 2015 in Germany, with the situation with so many migrants and refugees coming to Germany, shows that it's absolutely no option, also not for Western states, for nobody. It's absolutely no option to say, well, the situation is as it is, and as it is, and African problems, as we mentioned them before, have nothing to do with us here in the West. I mean, that's simply a flawed argument.
Okay.
And therefore, I think the refugee crisis, if we may call it like this, changed the mindsets of Western politicians as well. Therefore, at least there is an increasing incentive to take that issue serious.
Okay. So, in conclusion, okay, I would say this interview has been part of a Free the Mental Slave series of interviews. So this is a project group which is built here on the school to try to promote this message about changing the mindset that people, not only Africans themselves, but people here have on Africa. Now, what is your opinion on this? And do you think it is actually a good idea to keep promoting the project as a sort of a Free the Mental Slave series?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, it's always good if students unite and come together and do something. That's the ideal of our students. So that students are not passively sitting somewhere and listening to what the professors say, write it down and reproduce it in the exams. But if students really, become active, that's the best we can see with our students. And therefore, in general, those students' initiatives are extremely important. And if it also are student initiatives that focus on important issues, and this is one of the most pressing issues in politics and in world economics that we have at the moment, then of course that's something I strongly support. And I'm happy that this student group actually came together and talks about those academic issues, and partly academic, partly political issues and economic issues. I think that is really good. Also, it's really good to raise awareness for Africa, because as you said, the image of Africa that we get in Western media or in media in general is necessarily, but still is biased, does not reflect the diversity of African cultures, of different African political systems. And raising awareness for Africa as a continent with 54 states and not being one single Africa, that's certainly something very important. On the other hand, also seeing Africa as one continent, the idea of African unity, the idea of networking of students, may be from African countries, maybe from other countries, of networking together, focusing on that issue. That's also something that such a student group could contribute to. And in the end, of course, your aim, as I have understood that, is also to change the world to the better.
Yes.
That's not only talking, but also doing something positive. I mean, that's wonderful.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so with that, I would like to bring this interview to a close. I would like to thank Professor Dr. Jakob Lempp for talking with us today.
Thank you.
To everyone watching, I also want to say thank you. And hopefully you have learned a lot, and your perception has been changed on certain things. And we hope to that you keep on watching the rest of the videos in this series. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right, have a good day. Bye. Okay.